was a huge story.
It's one of the greatest true crime stories of all time.
Sex and betrayal and lies.
A beautiful young nurse, only 3 months into her marriage, brutally murdered in cold blood.
He sees his gorgeous bride dead in a pool of blood on the living room floor.
It's like being hit by a train. Just like being hit by a train.
This was a cold, calculated murder.
She was shot at point-blank range.
Investigators believed Sherri was the victim of a burglary turned murder.
But not everyone was convinced. There was another piece of evidence, a bite mark on Sherri's forearm.
Well, lo and behold, the bite mark came from a woman.
Investigators began zeroing in on a 25-year veteran of the LAPD who was hiding in plain sight.
There had never been an arrest of an active LAPD for murder under circumstances this salacious.
Friday night, the stunning case where nothing's as it seems.
A case with a twist no Hollywood writer could have come up with.
And now the controversial parole hearing unfolding this week that could change everything. The Killer Down the Hall. The all-new 2020 true crime event. Friday night at 9/8 Central on ABC.
Now let's begin. Sherri Rasmussen woke up that morning with her back aching from an aerobics class the day before. She had a presentation scheduled at the hospital where she worked, a workplace initiative she privately thought was pointless. She told her husband, John Rutan, that she was considering calling in sick. He kissed her goodbye at 7:20 a.m. and left for his new engineering job in Chatsworth. She was still in her nightgown when the door shut behind him. By that evening, John had called the condo repeatedly with no answer. He called her office. She hadn't shown up. He drove home to the condominium on Balboa Boulevard and found broken glass near the entrance. Her BMW was gone. Inside, he found Sherri on the living room floor. She had been shot 3 times and struck repeatedly in the face and head with a blunt object. According to prosecutors who later tried the case, the scene showed clear signs of a violent, sustained struggle, not a quick, opportunistic act. To understand why this happened, you have to understand who Sherri Rasmussen was, because the woman on that floor was not a passive victim. She was, by every account, one of the most capable people in any room she walked into. She was born February 7, 1957, and raised in Arizona. Her kindergarten teacher moved her ahead a grade and used her as a classroom aide. That's how far ahead of her peers she already was. She started college at 16. She transferred into the nursing program at Loma Linda University, graduated, and went straight into the coronary care unit at UCLA Medical Center. She later earned her master's degree in nursing from UCLA. By 27, she was director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, one of the youngest people ever to hold that position there. Her sister Connie has said that when Sherri committed to something, she gave it everything she had. Her father, Nels Rasmussen, described a daughter who did not quit, who did not back down, who would not go down without what he called an extraordinary fight. Keep that description in mind. It's going to matter more than you think. She was also 6 feet tall, athletic, and competitive, a runner, a tennis player, someone who moved through the world with physical confidence. And by 1984, at a party, she met a mechanical engineer named John Rutan. According to her family, she fell for him almost immediately. They ran together. They played tennis together. Her sister Connie has said you could see the happiness in her eyes in the wedding photos, that it wasn't performed for the camera, it was real. They married in November 1985 and moved into a condominium that Sherri's parents had bought years earlier, specifically chosen because it had a drive-in garage, so their daughter would never have to walk alone from a street-side parking spot at night. Sherri paid her father rent equal to the mortgage. She set the burglar alarm code to 1123, her wedding anniversary. A friend once told her that code was too easy to guess. She said she'd change it. She never got the chance. What Sherri didn't fully understand, what she was only beginning to piece together in the weeks before her death, was that John Rutan came with something attached to his past that had never actually let go. Someone who had loved him first, who believed, on some level, that he still belonged to her. And that person had access to information, tools, and a badge that made her uniquely dangerous. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus, and by February of 1986, she was a rookie Los Angeles police officer with 2 years on the job. If this case is already getting under your skin, that's the right response. This isn't a story built for shock value. It's a story about a woman whose family spent over 2 decades fighting to be heard. If you want to see that fight through with us, subscribe now, because what happens next is going to test how much institutional failure you can actually sit with. In the next part, we go back further to a UCLA dormitory in the late 1970s, where this all actually started, 4 years before Sherri Rasmussen ever knew Stephanie Lazarus's name. John Ruetten and Stephanie Lazarus met in 1978 in Dykstra Hall, a dormitory at UCLA. They lived on the same floor. Over the next 4 years, according to Ruetten's own testimony at Lazarus's 2012 murder trial, the two were physically involved on and off. He described it as casual, never a real relationship, nothing he considered serious on his end. On Stephanie's end, it was a different story entirely. Former classmates and roommates described a woman who had built an entire private world around John Ruetten, long before he had any idea how deep it went. She kept his clothing. She photographed him without his knowledge. She threw him a surprise birthday party at 25, seemingly unaware that he was seeing other women that entire time, and that whatever she believed existed between them had already ended in his mind. After graduating, Stephanie made a choice that would define the next 3 decades of both their lives. She joined the Los Angeles Police Department Academy and graduated in 1983. She introduced Ruetten to colleagues as her college boyfriend. She was his date to a company holiday party. And around this time, she purchased a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver through the department as her authorized backup firearm, a detail that would sit quietly in a file for over 2 decades before it became one of the most important facts in the entire case. In June of 1985, Stephanie learned that John was engaged. According to journal entries later entered into evidence at trial, she wrote that she couldn't concentrate on work that day, that her focus had collapsed entirely. Her roommate at the time, a fellow LAPD officer, later said he had never once seen her cry, until that night. What happened over the following months is the part of this story that should have ended everything, if anyone with authority had taken it seriously. Weeks after learning of the engagement, Stephanie went to John's condo before he'd even moved in with Sherri. They were intimate one final time, something John would later testify he agreed to in order to give her, in his words, a sense of closure. He didn't tell Sherri. When he eventually confessed, Sherri was hurt, but she forgave him. She wanted the marriage to work, and she believed it could. She did not yet know that Stephanie had no intention of stepping aside. In July of 1985, Stephanie showed up unannounced at Sherri's workplace, Glendale Adventist Medical Center, on a day off, dressed casually, and told Sherri directly that she and John were still involved, and that when the relationship failed, she'd be there waiting. Sherri told her that wouldn't be necessary. According to accounts Sherri gave her family afterward, Stephanie's response as she walked away was a direct threat aimed at her personally, a warning that if she couldn't have John, no one would. Sherri went home and told her father. Nels told John. John confronted Stephanie and asked her to stop. He did not, however, cut off contact with her entirely, a decision that, in hindsight, gave her continued access to information about the relationship, the wedding plans, and eventually the home Sherri and John would share. The wedding happened anyway in November 1985 as planned, but Stephanie kept finding reasons to be near them. In January 1986, she arrived at the condo with a pair of skis and asked John to wax them for her. Arriving in workout clothes, Sherri would later describe to her father as deliberately provocative. Sherri found the visit unsettling enough to ask John directly whether the relationship was truly over. He told her it was. She asked him not to personally deliver the skis back to Stephanie. He agreed. A few days later, after John had already left for work, Stephanie returned to collect the skis herself, in her LAPD uniform, armed, alone in the apartment with the woman who had married the man she believed still belonged to her. There was at least one more documented incident that same month. Sherri came downstairs one morning and found Stephanie already inside the living room, in uniform. Sherri asked her to leave. She left. Sherri told her father about it. She did not tell John, and she did not report it to the police because, as she put it to her family, the person doing this was the police. Nuys Rasmussen tried to intervene however he could. He urged John to end all contact. He even offered to help John find engineering work in Tucson, just to get the couple out of Los Angeles entirely. Nothing worked. By early February 1986, Sherri was telling her father she believed she was being followed 5 separate times in a single week, by someone who would appear on the street and vanish the moment Sherri looked directly at her. She was trying to hold her marriage together. She didn't want John to feel like everything was already falling apart around them. So she carried most of this alone, telling her father in pieces, telling almost no one else. She had no way of knowing that within 3 weeks, on a Monday morning when her back ached and she decided to stay home from work, all of that silence would run out of time. If you've ever had a warning sign you couldn't get anyone to take seriously, a threat that sounded too specific to ignore, but too unofficial for anyone to act on, you already understand what made this case so devastating. Nuys Rasmussen understood it too, and it's the reason he spent the next 23 years refusing to let this go. If his persistence means something to you, stay with us, because in the next part, everything comes to a head on February 24, 1986, and the investigation that follows is where this case truly goes wrong. The night before, on February 23rd, a friend of John's visited the condo. When the friend left, they went out through the front door rather than the garage, and in the process the door was left unlocked. Neither John nor Sherri realized it. The next morning, John left at 7:20, kissed his wife goodbye, and drove to Chatsworth for his new job. Stephanie Lazarus had the day off. Her roommate had moved out 10 days earlier, leaving her alone in her own apartment. At her 2023 parole hearing, decades later, she gave investigators and the parole board her own account of what happened next, the first time she had ever described it in her own words. She said she called the condo that morning, hoping to hear John's voice. Sherri answered instead. She said hearing Sherri's voice enraged her. She said she decided, in that moment, to go to the condo, with some plan of binding Sherri and waiting for John to come home. She admitted to the board, 37 years later, that the plan made no real sense even to her. She didn't need it to. The front door was already unlocked. What happened inside that condominium over the following hours is known almost entirely through physical evidence, because only one person survived to describe it, and she would not do so honestly for another 23 years. The struggle moved through multiple rooms. A porcelain vase was shattered. A phone was knocked over. Sherri fought back, and she fought hard. She was 6 feet tall, athletic, and according to everyone who knew her, not someone who gave up easily. At some point during the struggle, she was bound. She broke free enough to crawl toward the front door, pressing a bloodied hand against the wall directly beside the burglar alarm panel, reaching for the panic button. She missed it by inches. Then came the gunshots, 3 of them, fired through a folded quilt draped over a nearby chair, muffling the sound. The barrel was pressed close enough against Sherri's body during the struggle to leave a visible bruise on her face. Medical examiners later confirmed that additional shots were fired even after the first wound would already have been fatal. Head Deputy District Attorney Shannon Presby later described Sherri's injuries as including significant trauma to her face and head, consistent with being struck repeatedly with a hard object. Then the staging began. Stereo equipment was moved and stacked near the base of the staircase, positioned as if someone had been in the process of carrying it out. A bloody handprint, consistent with a gloved hand, was left on top of the stack. But Sherri's jewelry box was left sitting untouched, in plain view on top of her dresser, the kind of item any actual burglar would have taken first. The killer took the BMW. She also took the couple's marriage certificate. 13 days later, Stephanie filed a report with the Santa Monica Police Department, not her own department, claiming her .38 caliber revolver had been stolen from her car near the pier. She never reported it to LAPD's own armorer, as department policy required for a duty-related weapon. A month later, she purchased a replacement revolver and reported that one correctly, through the proper channels. The original weapon, the one that mattered, has never been recovered. At her parole hearing, Stephanie admitted she had disposed of it herself, specifically to avoid being identified. She has never said where. The BMW turned up 11 days after the murder, parked 2 miles from the condo on a residential street, keys still in the ignition. Every surface had been wiped clean, not a single usable fingerprint anywhere inside or outside the vehicle. It had been left near a school known for at-risk youth, as though someone hoped a teenager might be tempted to take it for a joyride and become a convenient false suspect. None of this was the work of a panicked burglar. It was the work of someone who understood, in granular detail, exactly what investigators would look for, because she was one. The night Sherri's body was found, lead detective Lyle Mayer sat down with John Rutan and laid out his theory before the forensic team had even finished processing the scene. He told John he believed the home had been burglarized, that whoever entered had likely been after the stereo equipment and other valuables. That theory, burglary gone wrong, was locked in almost immediately, and it would go essentially unchallenged for the next 18 years. The next morning, when Nels and Loretta Rasmussen learned their daughter was dead, Nels had one question for the detectives standing in front of him. Not who found her, not what the scene looked like. His first question was whether they had looked into John's ex-girlfriend, the one who was a police officer. He was told there was nothing there. That was day 2 of the investigation. That door, the only door that actually led anywhere, would stay shut for the next 23 years. This is the part of the story where a lot of viewers start to feel something shift from grief into anger, because from this point forward, this stops being only a story about one woman's murder, and becomes a story about an institution that had every tool it needed to stop protecting one of its own, and chose not to use it. If that anger is building in you right now, hold on to it, because in the next part we go inside the 23 years of failures, missing files, and a whistleblower who paid a real professional price for refusing to look away. What followed Sherri's murder was not an active investigation so much as a slow institutional drift away from the truth, dressed up in the paperwork of one. A nearby burglary involving 2 male suspects, one of them armed, gave detectives a theory that conveniently matched the story they'd already decided on. Composite sketches of 2 men went out across Van Nuys. Tips came in. None of them led anywhere because none of them were relevant. The marriage certificate taken from the condo that morning was never recovered. Nels Rasmussen refused to accept the silence. He flew from Tucson to Los Angeles repeatedly over the following years, meeting every new detective who inherited the file, bringing his notes, bringing the same name every single time. Each visit ended the same way. He was sent home with nothing new. In 1987, a single note finally appeared in the investigation log confirming that John had called to verify Stephanie Lazarus was a former girlfriend. It was the first time her name had ever appeared in any official record connected to the case. Nothing was done with it. In 1989, 3 years after Sherri's death, John learned Stephanie was planning a trip to Hawaii with friends. Before joining her, he called Detective Mayer directly to make sure there was nothing tying her to the murder. Mayer told him there wasn't. John went. He and Stephanie were intimate again during that trip, something he later described under oath as the mistake of a young and foolish man. He was 30 years old. His wife had been dead for 3 years. He had, by his own account, called the lead detective specifically to confirm his suspicion was unfounded before seeing her again. In 1993, with DNA testing technology now advancing rapidly, Nels offered to personally pay for testing on the bite mark evidence out of his own pocket. He was told the department needed a suspect first, before any testing would be authorized. He said he already had one. He was told to move on. He wrote directly to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates. He was told, essentially, that he'd watched too much television. Detective Mayer retired in 1991. His partner was reassigned. New detectives who later inherited the file discovered that pages were missing. Specifically, the recordings of Nels's earliest interviews with investigators, the ones where he named Stephanie directly. Other interview recordings from the same period remained fully intact. Only the ones naming her had disappeared. Meanwhile, Stephanie Lazarus's career advanced without interruption. She was promoted to detective in 1994. She married a fellow LAPD officer. She adopted a daughter. She became an academy instructor and was, on 2 separate occasions during the 1990s, assigned to the Van Nuys division, the same division where the Rasmussen murder book sat in a filing cabinet the entire time. Former colleagues later recalled that she frequently volunteered for quiet overnight shifts there, when supervision was minimal. By the 2000s, she had moved into high-profile art theft investigations and was, by every visible measure, a respected and accomplished detective. Nobody knew. Nobody was allowed to look. The case finally broke because one criminalist refused to stop asking questions. In 2004, Jennifer Francis joined LAPD's cold case DNA unit and was assigned the Rasmussen file. Reading through it carefully, she noticed the bite mark evidence entry was incomplete. The original swab wasn't listed in the evidence log. She called the coroner's office. It wasn't there either. She searched the evidence freezers herself by hand for 6 hours. At the back of one freezer, behind other containers, she found a torn envelope with a faded label. The name Rasmussen was still legible. Inside, after 18 years of storage, was the original swab from the bite wound on Sherri's arm. The DNA came back female. It did not match Sherri. Someone else, a woman, had left biological evidence on Sherri Rasmussen's body during the attack, and it had survived nearly 2 decades by accident. When Francis asked her supervisor whether the third-party woman referenced in the file, the one who had harassed Sherri before her death, had ever been investigated, she was told yes, and told, almost as an aside, that the woman in question wasn't just an ex-girlfriend. She was an LAPD detective. Francis was told the case remained officially a burglary, and that the detective in question was not to be treated as part of the investigation. She didn't accept that answer. She brought her findings to the cold case unit. Redirected to the scientific division. Redirected to robbery homicide. Redirected again. Every door gave her the same message in different words. Stop pushing. What followed, according to her own sworn statements, was retaliation. Her supervisor questioned her mental stability and described her as paranoid. She was ordered into mandatory counseling inside a department that kind of order marks you. She said the therapist assigned to her seemed more interested in what she knew and who she told than in her actual well-being. Her casework was quietly reassigned. Colleagues suggested she find a hobby. She said she stayed silent for a long time afterward, specifically out of fear of further retaliation. The case sat until March 2008, when Detective Jim Nuttall found 2 cold case files waiting on his desk. One was Sherri Rasmussen's. He read Francis's 4-year-old DNA report and looked at the crime scene photos with fresh eyes. The untouched jewelry box, the bloody handprint on the stereo equipment that had never been properly photographed or collected, the unforced alarm system. None of it read as burglary. It never had. Nuttall and his partner, Pete Barba, went back to John Rutan, who told them, for the record, this time, that he had given Stephanie's name to LAPD 23 years earlier. That conversation had never once been documented. They built a list of 5 female suspects connected to the case and eliminated 4. Stephanie was the 5th, because she worked in the same building, on the same floor, and her husband was also a Van Nuys detective. They referred to her only as number 5 and never wrote her name in their notes. Records confirmed she had owned a .38 caliber revolver in 1986, and that 13 days after the murder, she had filed a theft report with an outside department instead of her own, with no evidence her car had actually been broken into. Hind on the table. The moment she was gone, officers collected it. They needed her DNA without her knowing. For a week, investigators quietly tracked her movements. On May 28, 2009, Stephanie and her daughter stopped at a Costco in Simi Valley. She used a plastic cup, finished her food, and walked away, leaving it behind on the table. The moment she was gone, officers collected it. It went to Jennifer Francis, the same criminalist who had spent 5 years being called paranoid, sent to mandatory counseling, and quietly managed out of her own casework for refusing to let this go. She ran the comparison herself. It matched. If you've ever done the right thing at work and watched the system punish you for it instead of the person who was actually guilty, this part of the story is for you. Jennifer Francis didn't get an apology. She got a match 23 years later that proved she'd been right the entire time. If that kind of quiet persistence means something to you, stay with us for the final part, because next we go inside the interrogation room, the trial, and the parole hearings that are still happening today. On June 5, 2009, at 6:40 in the morning, Detective Daniel Jaramillo approached Stephanie Lazarus at her desk in the Commercial Crimes Division and told her he needed her expertise downstairs. A suspect in custody with information about stolen art, her specialty. She agreed without hesitation and followed him to the jail facility in the basement, the one part of the building where no one, regardless of rank, was permitted to carry a firearm. She handed over her weapon at the entrance. Inside the interrogation room, detectives Greg Stearns and Daniel Jaramillo started slowly. They mentioned her name had come up in some old notes. Nothing serious, just a few things they wanted to clear up quietly. Stephanie relaxed. She talked about UCLA, about the dormitory, about John Rutan. Nothing serious, she said, just something that drifted apart a long time ago. When Sherri's name came up, she said she thought Sherri had been a nurse, though she couldn't quite remember. When asked if she knew what had happened to her, she said she'd heard Sherri had been killed. She'd seen a poster at work once, maybe mentioned it to someone. She described it with the detachment of someone recalling a story that had nothing to do with her. As Stearns began laying out the evidence, the female DNA, the bite mark, the possibility of a direct comparison sample, her composure started to fracture. She said she might be willing to provide a swab voluntarily. Then she said she needed to speak with someone. Then she stood up, said the situation felt unreal, and walked toward the door. Officers were waiting in the corridor. She was placed under arrest 23 years, 3 months, and 11 days after she walked out of Sherri Rasmussen's home. The trial began in January 2012 and lasted 3 weeks. According to prosecutors, this was a case built on a bite, a bullet, a gun barrel, and a broken heart. A scorned woman motive supported directly by Stephanie's own journal entries, which had been entered into evidence. John Rutan testified and wept multiple times on the stand. He described the final encounter with Stephanie after his engagement as a mistake he deeply regretted. When asked why he hadn't pushed harder to name her as a suspect back in 1986, he said it had genuinely never occurred to him that she could be responsible, and that Detective Mayer had personally assured him, shortly after the murder, that she'd already been cleared. Nuys Rasmussen testified about 23 years of phone calls and folders that arrived thinner each time he flew out from Tucson, and about the very first question he ever asked investigators, the one that was never properly answered. Jennifer Francis testified about the swab, the freezer, and what it cost her professionally to keep pursuing it after being told to stop. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Stephanie Lazarus of first-degree murder. On March 8, 2012, she was sentenced to 27 years to life, plus 2 additional years for the use of a firearm. Every appeal she filed was denied. She was permitted to retire from the LAPD before her conviction was finalized and began collecting her pension immediately. By 2017, she had received nearly $67,000 of it. In November 2023, under a California law allowing special parole consideration for crimes committed by offenders under 26, she had been 25 the day she went to that condo. Stephanie appeared before a parole board for the first time. For the first time in 23 years, she offered an account of what actually happened. She said it made her sick that she had taken an oath to protect and serve and had instead taken Sherri Rasmussen's life. She described calling that morning hoping to hear John's voice, hearing Sherri's instead, and being overcome with rage. She described going to the condo, the binding, the shots fired through the quilt. The panel initially recommended parole. At the full board review, John Rutan argued the confession had come only because it was her one remaining path to release, noting she'd had 23 years to come forward and had instead spent them lying and hiding evidence while continuing to build her life and career. Sherri's niece made the same point directly to the board. The board also heard from Nuys Rasmussen through a recorded statement. He had died on June 20, 2020, before this hearing ever took place, but before his death he had recorded testimony specifically to be played at every future parole hearing, for as long as the recording existed. He spoke about the damage done to his daughter's face and said it seemed less like an accident of struggle and more like something deliberate. In October 2024, the full board rescinded the parole grant. In February 2025, a new request was denied outright. Parole Commissioner Kevin Chappell told her directly that her account of a fight didn't match the physical evidence, that if it had truly been a mutual struggle, more of her DNA would have been recovered at the scene. He told her plainly that she had been the only one engaging in that level of violence. She will be eligible to apply again in 2028. Her mother, Loretta Rasmussen, died in September 2022 without ever seeing justice fully resolved. Sherri's 2 surviving sisters, Teresa and Connie, are expected to oppose parole again when the time comes. To date, the LAPD has never opened a formal internal investigation into how key evidence and interview recordings disappeared from this case for over 20 years. No detective has ever been disciplined. Jennifer Francis's whistleblower lawsuit was unsuccessful. The Rasmussen family's civil suit against the department was dismissed as time-barred. Every avenue for institutional accountability has been closed, one way or another. Sherri Rasmussen was 29 years old. She was a nursing director, a wife of 92 days, a daughter who called her father when something felt wrong, even when she didn't fully understand why. Her niece later wore Sherri's wedding dress at her own wedding, wanting to carry a piece of her aunt into one of the most important days of her life. The marriage certificate taken from that condo in 1986 has never been found. If someone in your life, anyone, including someone with authority, a badge, or a position of trust, is making you feel unsafe, tell someone outside of that person's circle of influence, and put it in writing if you can. Sherri told her father. She told her husband. She told colleagues. It mattered, eventually, just 23 years later than it should have. If you're dealing with stalking or harassment right now, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233, and the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center has guidance at stalkingawareness.org. You don't have to wait for someone else to take it seriously before you take it seriously yourself. If this case affected you, tell us which part hit hardest. And if you want more stories where the real crime is what the system allowed to happen, subscribe. There's more of this coming.